Hello, everyone. We are going to look at this role today called the questioner. So we have been learning the last couple of weeks about the predictor and the clarifier, and we've had lots of practice. And so now we're going to learn about this role called the questioner. And I'm just going to read it here, and sorry, I have to scroll over. Ask two open-ended and good discussion questions about the text. One should be a question to make sure we understand the text, and another should be an opinion question where we get to state how we think and feel while using text evidence to support our thinking. So the whole point of this reciprocal teaching is that we're going to get a chance to dig into a text, whether that be a book or a video or an article or a picture, whatever it is. We get the chance, when we get the chance to talk about it with other people that have read or looked at or watched the same thing, we get to understand it more deeply because we're going to get to hear what other people think. So as the questioner, it is your job to dig in and literally find some questions that you can ask. So with the predictor and the clarifier, those you're going to share with the group after what you did. But with this questioner, you literally are going to create these questions that you're going to have a chance to discuss. So that is what we're doing here. That's what the roll sheet looks like. And so we want to make sure that our questions are before we get into creating some questions, I just want to talk about kind of what makes a good question. And so I'm just going to go to our presentation here. And so there's a couple different things that we're going to look at when we are creating a question. So we want to look at closed questions versus open-ended questions. If our whole goal is to create discussion questions, we're going to be looking to make questions that are more open. So there's more than one answer, more than one way of seeing how it could be answered, more than one perspective. It still can be a question about the text, but maybe there's differing pieces of evidence that you find. So we want to make sure that our questions are open. And then I'm going to scroll just a little ways down here. There's a couple different ways that we can create open questions. So we can ask questions about the text. So that's a question about what is written or what you see or what's in the movie. But then we can also ask questions that make sure we're thinking critically. So questions about what you're thinking as you read or you watch something, and then heart questions. And heart questions are how we feel while reading the text or how the text can make us better people. So there's a lot of different types of questions we can ask, but I'm going to scroll up here one more time. We just want to really make sure that we're asking these open-ended discussion questions, questions that are not just one-word answers, questions that ask us to state our opinion or provide evidence or explain kind of why we're thinking that. Okay, so I'm going to show you just now. I'm going to go back and we're going to look at an article and we're going to look at this questioner role. So as I'm reading, I'm going to try to come up with two questions that I could talk to my group with or my group about this article that we're going to read. So I found this one for you about how George Washington did his hair, because who doesn't want to learn about George Washington and his hairdo? So I'm going to read just a little bit here, and then we're going to talk about how we can create some of these questions. So it says, George Washington's hairstyle is iconic and simple enough that most Americans can probably recall it in an instant. Or they can at least refresh their memory by pulling out a dollar bill or a quarter. It was pulled back from his forehead and puffy on the sides. It was colored gray-white, perhaps like many wigs of the day, but Washington never wore a wig. At National Geographic, Robert Krulwich writes that he was stunned to learn this fact. It came from Ron Chernow's book, Washington, A Life. Krulwich explains, turns out that hair was his, all of it. The pigtail, the poofy part in the back, that roll of perfect curls near his neck. What's more, though you probably already guessed this, he wasn't white-haired. There's a painting of him as a young man with Martha and her two children that shows his hair as a reddish brown, which Chernow said was his true color. The painting is The Courtship of Washington by John C. McCrae. It was painted in 1860, long after Washington's death in 1799, but a project out of the University of Virginia called The Papers of George Washington also confirms that the first president's natural hair color was light brown. The style he favored wasn't fancy, though it may appear so to modern eyes. It was a military style called a queue. It was the 18th century equivalent of a Marine buzz cut, Krulwich writes. With charming illustrations, artist Wendy McNaughton brings to life Washington's routine. It included the gathering, enthusiastic yank back. That was to try and broaden the forehead. Then there was the fluffing of the hair on the side and the powdering. Even if Washington didn't wear a wig, as some of his contemporaries sported, he did powder his hair. It gave it that white look. It may also have been the fashion in America to wear less elaborate wig styles if one wore a wig at all. Okay, so as I'm looking at this, a couple of things that I can see as I'm reading. So I'm going to first do my text question. So something about what I read, something that could have multiple answers. And here is what I was thinking. So I'm going to go with, why aren't there more pictures of George Washington with light brown hair? And so that would be a text question because I can answer that. It's an opinion, so I get to decide why I think he didn't have more pictures of him with light brown hair. And there could be several reasons that someone could pick out of here. It could be because it was the style to have this queue, which was the 18th century equivalent of a marine buzz cut. It was the style for men to wear wigs. So maybe he wanted to powder his hair and make it look like he was wearing a wig because that's what everybody else was doing. Maybe he had another reason. So it talked in here about broadening his forehead. So he wanted to broaden his forehead. So there's a couple different reasons that people could pick out of here, but all of those, I could pull those pieces of evidence out of the text. So that would make that one a good text question. Another question that I could ask, so I'm going to go to that opinion or head or heart question. And so remember, if I show you what we're looking for here, the opinion or head heart questions are asking questions to make sure about what you're thinking, or asking a question about how you feel while you're reading the text or how it can make us a better person. So the question I thought would be good here is, if the popular style was to wear wigs, would you wear one? Why or why not? And so as we're reading here, it's basically talking about how George Washington had this iconic hairstyle, but everyone else was wearing wigs, and he was doing this to kind of be a rebel almost. And since it was the style for people to wear wigs, he wanted it to make it seem like he was wearing a wig, but he didn't. So I want to ask a question of my group and see, like, well, what would you do? Would you wear the wig if that's what everyone else was doing? Would you George Washington it and make it seem like you were wearing a wig even though you weren't? So that is my thinking question. So it's my thinking question that I'm going to ask my group. So that is how we create questions, and we're going to try this with the question or role.